Chapter 3 of All in the Day's Work by Ida Tarbell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. A Coeducational College of the 80s. When I entered Allegheny College in the fall of 1876, I made my first contact with the past. I had been born and reared a pioneer. I knew only the beginning of things, the making of a home in the wilderness, the making of an industry from the ground up. I had seen the hardships of beginnings, the joy of realization, the attacks that success must expect. But of things with a past, things that had made themselves permanent, I knew nothing. It struck me full in the face now, for this was an old college, as things west of the Alleghenies were reckoned, an old college in an old town. Here was history, and I had never met it before to recognize it. The town lay in the valley of a tributary of the Allegheny River, French Creek. Its oldest tradition, after the tales of Indians, was that George Washington once drank from a spring on the edge of the campus. Certainly he passed that way in 1753, when he came up the river valley from Fort Duquesne, Pittsburgh, following the route which led to Fort Le Boeuf near Lake Erie. He comments in his diary, published the year after his trip, on the extensive, rich meadows through which he had passed, one of which, I believe, was nearly 4 miles in length and considerable wider in some places. To this particular rich meadow, a few years later, came one David Meade, and laid out a town and sold land. Here soon after came the representative of the Holland Land Company, colonizers of first quality. Good men came, distinguished names in Pennsylvania's history, and they wanted a college. The answer to their wish came in 1815, when one of the most scholarly men of that day, Timothy Alden of Massachusetts, heard their call and, picking up all his worldly possessions, made the 2 months' trip by coach and boat to the settlement called Meadville. Timothy Alden, like many of his fellows, was fired by a deep belief that through Christian democracy alone could men arrive at the better world towards which he, scholar that he was, knew they had been groping from their earliest beginnings. But men could only come to an understanding of their individual and collective responsibilities to democracy through education. Therefore, as men spread westward, he and others like him must follow them, with education. But once in Meadville, how little he found with which to carry out his project! A log courthouse for a schoolhouse, and little or no money, though of what they had men gave freely. Now, Timothy Allen knew that throughout the East were men of scholarly traditions, convinced, as was he, that democracy would only work if men were trained to understanding and sacrifice. He believed that they would help his Western venture. In 1816 he went East to find out. He was not wrong in thinking there would be sympathy for the young college. Out of their meager store men gave. This one 50 cents, that one $5, few more. And men gave books, 1, 2, 5. The list of donors now in the college archives shows many of the best-known names of the day: Lowell, Adams, Tucker, Parkman, Channing in Boston, and 29 fine New York names. Friends were made for Allegheny in every town and city where its brave story was told. Timothy Alden came back with $361 in money, and with books, more needed than money, estimated to be worth $1,642.26. From that time, he kept the undertaking steadily before the East, promoted it by every method known to the times. A great response to his passionate effort came in 1819, when the college world of the East was shocked by learning that William Bentley of Salem, Massachusetts, had left his famous collection of classical and theological books, dictionaries, lexicons, and Bibles to a college in the wilderness of northwestern Pennsylvania, a college without a home, still doing its work in a log courthouse. That gift, long a bitter drop in the cup of Harvard, it is said, made a home of its own necessity for Allegheny, and in 1820 the cornerstone of Bentley Hall, named for the donor, was laid. It took many years to complete it, but when done on the lines Timothy Alden had himself laid down, it was one of the most beautiful buildings in the country. Today it easily stands, after Independence Hall, as the most perfect piece of colonial architecture in the state of Pennsylvania. For me, Bentley Hall was an extraordinary experience. It was the first really beautiful building I had seen, a revelation, something I had never dreamed of. 56 years had passed since the cornerstone of Bentley Hall was laid, and not one of them without disappointments and sacrifices. More than once it had seemed as if the brave attempt must fail. 2 buildings only had been added in these years: Culver Hall, a frame boarding house for men; Reuter Hall, a grim, uncompromising, 3-story rectangular brick structure, 50 by 90 feet in size, a perfect reflection of the straitened period to which it belonged. The Factory was our slighting name for Reuter Hall, but in this stern structure I was to find a second deep satisfaction: the library. In a room on the top floor, 90 feet long and at least 16 in height, was housed not only the splendid Bentley collection, but one even more valuable, that of Judge James Winthrop of Cambridge, Massachusetts, rare volumes from the great presses of Europe, 3 tons of books brought overland in wagons by Boston teamsters in 1822. They lined the great unbroken inside wall, as well as every space between openings. From the window seats one looked out on the town in the valley, its roofs and towers half hidden by a wealth of trees, and beyond to a circle of round-breasted hills. Before I left Allegheny, I had found a very precious thing in that severe room: the companionship there is in the silent presence of books. Allegheny did not, of course, admit women at the start, but the ferment caused by the passing of the 14th Amendment, making it clear that only men were to be regarded as citizens, stirred the Allegheny constituents mightily. Its chief patron, as I have said, was the Methodist Church. Now, the Methodist Church was a militant reformer. The greatest of its bishops, Matthew Simpson, had backed Mrs. Stanton and Miss Anthony and their colleagues at every step. Leaders among Methodist women had been abolitionists, aggressive temperance advocates, and now they became militant suffragists. Their influence began to tell. In 1870, with misgivings in not a few minds, the admission of women was voted. This was the same year that the University of Michigan opened its doors to women, and 2 years before Cornell. In the 6 years before I entered, 10 women had graduated. When I came, there were but 2 seniors, 2 juniors, no sophomores. I was a lone freshman in a class of 40 hostile or indifferent boys. The friendly and facetious professor charged with the care of the young ladies put it that I was lost in the wilderness of boy. From the first I was dimly conscious that I was an invader, that there was abroad a spirit of masculinity challenging my right to be there, and there were taboos not to be disregarded. My first experience was that of which Virginia Woolf speaks so bitterly in A Room of One's Own, the closing of the college green to her at Oxbridge. Nearly 50 years before her book was written, I was having at Allegheny the same experience. The sloping green of the campus below Bentley Hall was inviting. Between classes, I made my way one day to a seat under a tree, only to hear a horrified call from the walk above. "Come back! Come back quick!" An imperative summons from an upper-class woman. "You mustn't go on that side of the walk. Only men go there." It was not so simple to find a spot where you could go and be comfortable. If Bentley Hall, where all the classes were held, was a beautiful piece of architecture, its interior could hardly have been more severe. The rooms were heated with pot-bellied cast-iron stoves, seated with the hardest wooden chairs, lighted by kerosene lamps. In winter, and the winters were long, the snow tracked in kept the floors wet and cold. Often one wore a muffler in chapel. But of all that I was unheeding. My pioneer childhood served me well. Moreover, I realized at the start that I had found what I had come to college for: direction in the only field in which I was interested, science. I found it in a way that I doubt if Cornell could have given me at the moment, shy and immature as I was, the warming and contagious enthusiasm of a great natural teacher, one who had an ardent passion for those things which had stirred me, and a wide knowledge which he fed by constant study and travel. Jeremiah Tingley, the head of Allegheny's Department of Natural Science. Professor Tingley was then a man of 50, sparkling, alive, informal. 3 years before, he had been one of the 50 chosen from many hundred applicants to spend the summer with Louis Agassiz on the island of Penikese in Buzzard's Bay. Agassiz had planned with enthusiasm for the Penikese summer school, and for those privileged to enter who could understand and appreciate it, it was an unforgettable experience. Certainly it was for Jeremiah Tingley. He carried there Agassiz's faith in observation and classification, as well as his reverence for nature and all her ways. For both men, the material world was but the cover of the spirit. Professor Tingley would quote Agassiz sometimes: "Nature always brings us back to absolute truth whenever we wander." This fervent faith had a profound and quieting effect on my religious tumult. I learned a new word, pantheism. Being still in that early stage of development where there must be a definite word by which to classify oneself, I began to call myself a pantheist, and I had a creed which I repeated more often than the creed I had learned in childhood. Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. It reassured me. I was on the right track, for was I not going to find out with the microscope what God and man are? Professor Tingley's method, for those he found really interested in scientific study, was to encourage them to look outside the book. There was where I had already found my joy, but I suspected it was the willful way, that the true way was to know first what was in the books. Here in Professor Tingley's classes you were ordered to go and see for yourself. He used to tell us a story of his first experience at Penikese. A stone was put before him, a round water-washed stone, on which he was to report. He looked at the stone, turned it over. There was nothing to report. It is not on the outside, it is the inside of things that matters, said Agassiz. And in the laboratory that became our watchword: look inside. Discovering my interest in the microscope, I was not only allowed, I was urged to use the magnificent binocular belonging to the college, was given the free run of the laboratory along with a few as crazy as myself. Here my most exciting adventure, apart from what I found under the microscope, came from actually having my hands on a missing link. Evolution, to which I was clinging determinedly, could only be established, I realized, by discovering the links. There was one peculiar to the waters in our valley, the Memopomo alleganiensis, a creature 12 to 15 inches long, with gills and one lung, able to live in the water or mud as circumstances required. The mud puppy, as it was appropriately called, was slimy, loathsome, but I worked over it with awe. Was I not being admitted into the very workshop of nature herself, seeing how she did it? Professor Tingley took his little group of laboratory devotees into his home circle. He and Mrs. Tingley were housed in a wing of Bentley Hall, big rooms built for classrooms. They had no children, and in the years of their study and travel they had gathered about them things of beauty and interest. The atmosphere of those rooms was something quite new and wonderful to me. It was my first look into the intimate social life possible to people interested above all in ideas, beauty, music, and glad to work hard and live simply to devote themselves to their cultivation. And such good talks! Most of it was concerned with fresh scientific thought, the inventions and discoveries which were stirring the world. An omnivorous reader of the scientific publications of Europe and America, Professor Tingley kept us excited, not only by what had been done, but what it might mean. There was the telephone. I had been in college but a few weeks when my father asked me to go with him and my brother to the Centennial Exposition of 1876. President Bugbee, who had made me his special care for a time, Mrs. Bugbee even taking me into their home until an appropriate boarding place could be found, was heartily in favor of my going. I went, and when I returned, Professor Tingley's first question was, "Did you see the telephone?" I hadn't even heard of it. 2 exhibits only of that exposition made a deep enough impression on me to last until today: my first Corot and the Corliss engine. Professor Tingley was greatly disappointed, and I did not understand why, until a few weeks later he called the student body together to explain and illustrate the telephone by a homemade instrument. "You'll talk to your homes from these rooms one day," he told us. "New York will talk to Boston." He didn't suggest Chicago. "Dreamer," the boys said. "Dreamer," my father and his Titusville friends said a little later when an agent of the Bell Associates, the first company to attempt putting the new invention within reach of everybody, came to town selling stock. How often I heard it said later, "If I'd bought that telephone stock." Years later, I told Alexander Graham Bell of my introduction to the telephone. "Nobody," he said, "can estimate what the teachers of science in colleges and high schools were doing in those days, not only to spread knowledge of the telephone, but to stir youth to tackle the possibilities in electricity." What I best remember is not the telephone, but Professor Tingley's amazing enthusiasm for the telephone. This revelation of enthusiasm, its power to warm and illuminate, was one of the finest and most lasting of my college experiences. The people I had known, teachers, preachers, doctors, businessmen, all went through their day's work either with a stubborn, often sullen determination to do their whole duty, or with an undercurrent of uneasiness, as if they found pleasure in duty. They seemed to me to feel that they were not really working if they were not demonstrating the Puritan teaching that labor is a curse. It had never seemed so to me, but I did not dare gloat over it. And here was a teacher who did gloat over his job in all its ramifications. Moreover, he did his best to stir you to share his joy. But while I looked on what I was learning in the laboratory as what I had come to college for, while each term stiffened my ambition to go deeper and deeper into the search for the original atom, science was not all that interested me. The faculty, if small, was made up largely of seasoned men with a perspective on life. There was not only deep seriousness, but humor and tolerance, and since we were so small a college, the student was close enough to discover them, to find out what each man as an individual had to offer him. As I learned the power of enthusiasm from Jeremiah Tingley, I learned from another man of that faculty the value of contempt. Holding the chair of Latin was one of the few able teachers I have known, George Haskins, father of that sound scholar of international repute, the late Charles Homer Haskins, at the time of his death Professor Emeritus of Medieval History at Harvard University. What deep satisfaction his career gave his father, himself a man of many disappointments. George Haskin labored, usually in vain, to arouse to us the choiceness of Latinity, the meaning of Rome's rise and fall, the quality of her men, the relation of that life to ours. Professor Haskin's contempt for our lack of understanding, for our slack preparation, was something utterly new to me in human intercourse. The people I knew, with rare exceptions, spared one another's feelings. I had come to consider that a superior grace. You must be kind, if you lied for it. But here was a man who turned on indifference, neglect, carelessness, with bitter and caustic contempt, left his victim seared. The sufferers lived to say, some of them at least, I deserved it. He was never unjust, never inappreciative of effort. Cherish your contempts. Henry James advised me once, when he had drawn from me a confession of the conflict between my natural dislike of saying anything unpleasant about anybody, and the necessity of being cruel, even brutal, if the work I had undertaken was to be truthful in fact and logic. Cherish your contempts, said Mr. James, and strength to your elbow. If it had not been for George Haskins, I doubt if I should have known what he meant, nor should I ever have become the steady, rather dogged worker I am. The contempt for shiftlessness which he inspired in me aroused a determination to be a good worker. I began to train my mind to go at its task regularly, keep hours, study whether I liked a thing or not. I forced myself not to waste time, not to loaf, not to give up before I finished. If I failed at any point in this discipline, I suffered a certain mental and spiritual malaise, a dissatisfaction with myself hard to live with. In spite of my painful efforts to make a regular worker out of myself, life at college was lightened by my discovery of the boy. Incredible as it seems to me now, I had come to college at 18 without ever having dared to look fully into the face of any boy of my age. To be sure, I had from childhood nourished secret passions for a succession of older individuals whom I never saw except at a distance, and with whom I never exchanged a word. My brother and his friends, my father and his friends, these I had always hobnobbed with, but those who naturally should have been my companions I shunned. I was unable to take part in those things that brought the young people of the day together. I did not dance, the Methodist discipline forbade it. I was incredibly stupid and uninterested in games, still am. I had no easy, companionable ways, was too shy to attempt them. I had my delights, the hills which I ran, the long drives behind our little white horse, the family doings, the reading of French regularly with my splendid friend Annette Grumbine, still living, still as she was then, a vitalizing influence in the town and state for all that makes for a higher social life. These things, and my precious evening walks, the full length of Titusville's main street, alone or with some girl friend while we talked of things deepest in our minds. But in all this there was no boy. I was not long in discovering him when I reached Allegheny, for the taboos I encountered at the start soon yielded under the increased number of women in college, in special courses, in the preparatory department. They swept masculine prohibitions out of the way, took possession, made a different kind of institution of it, less scholastic, gayer, easier going. The daily association in the classrooms, the contacts and appraisements, the mutual interests and intimacies, the continual procession of college doings which, in the nature of things, required that you should have a masculine attendant, soon put me at my ease. I was learning fast, but the learning carried its pains. I still had a stiff-necked determination to be free. To avoid entangling alliances of all kinds had become an obsession with me. I was slow in laying it aside when I began to take part in the social life of the college, and because of it, I was guilty of one performance which was properly enough a scandal to the young men. There were several men's fraternities in the college. Most of the boys belonged to one or another. It was an ambition of the fraternities to put their pins on acceptable town and college girls. You were a Delta girl, or a Gamma girl, or a Phi Psi girl. I resented this effort to tag me. Why should I not have friends in all the fraternities? And I had. I accumulated 4 pins, and then, one disastrous morning, went into chapel with the 4 pins on my coat. There were a few months after that when, if it had not been for 2 or 3 non-frat friends, I should have been a social outcast. I spent 4 years in Allegheny College. Measured by what I got instead of by what I did not get and was obliged to learn later, I regard them as among the most profitable of my life. I find often that men and women accuse the college of not opening their minds to life as it is in the world. For a mind sufficiently developed to see life as it is, I cannot conceive a more fruitful field than the classics. If I had been sufficiently mature, I could have learned from George Haskins' teachings of Cicero and Tacitus and Livy more than I know today about the ways of men in their personal and their national relations, more of the causes of war, of the weaknesses of governments. But I was not ready for it. Life is the great teacher, and she leads us step by step. It is not the fault of the human teacher that his pupil must learn to climb by climbing. It was in the spring of 1880 that I graduated. I still carried the same baggage with which I had entered. A little heavier, to be sure, a little better packed, a little better adapted to the purpose. The only difference which threatened disturbance was that I had added an item which I had refused to bring with me in 1876. Then I was not willing to believe I would ever marry. Now I thought possibly some day I might. But the item was not heavy enough at least to prevent my rejoicing over the fact that I was graduating with a job. I had signed a contract with an institution of which I had never heard until the negotiations leading to it opened. After frequent communications with the faculty, a representative of the Poland Union Seminary of Poland, Ohio, with some misgivings, had employed me to serve as its preceptress. $500 a year and board yourself. I was jubilant. It meant economic independence, the first plank in my platform. I would use my leisure to work with the microscope. I would save my money. I would one day go abroad and study with some great biologist. I would never abandon my search for the beginning of life, the point where I expected to find God. It was then with entire confidence in the future that I started out, in August of 1880, for the town of Poland, on the western reserve of Ohio, to begin what women were then talking of, in more or less awed tones, as a career. End of chapter 3.